Hey everyone, and welcome to another healthcare news episode. And today we're going to be covering everything from the month of March. Once again, I really appreciate everyone who left feedback on our last episode, and I'll be implementing all of that here. Everyone seemed to really enjoy the detailed analysis of IVF, abortion, and flawed medical research. So I'll do the same for this month's episode. Here we're going to focus on a pig kidney transplant into a human, the World Happiness Report, a somewhat flawed study on intermittent fasting, and the abortion pill case. After that, just like last month, I'm going to run through the rest of all relevant healthcare news from this month so that you can have a full picture of what's going on. So sit back and enjoy today's episode. You are now listening to the Gustavo Franco podcast, where we challenge the norms and uncover the truths of our healthcare system. I'm your host, Gustavo Franco. Let's start with one of my favorites from this month. A pig kidney was transplanted into a human. You heard that right. A pig, like the animal that we eat. A couple of Harvard surgeons in Boston were able to help this 62-year-old black patient with kidney failure by transplanting this kidney from a genetically engineered pig into the 60-year-old man. Being a bit of a science geek myself, it's no surprise that this was one of my favorites from this month. So let me break it down for you. Cross-species organ transplants are not a first at all. Blood transfusions from animals date back to the 17th century. And in the 1960s, a bunch of patients got kidney transplants from chimpanzees, but all 13 of those patients ended up dying. In the 90s, there was even a baboon liver transplant, but the patient also died pretty soon after that. But this time, things are different. Pigs have been found to be our best bet at organ transfers. And in 2022, there was a pig organ transplanted to a patient, but the patient died 2 months after. This time, if everything works out, which it has so far, the FDA could approve clinical trials, and it could mean that animal transplants become an actual medical standard. So you couple that with the organ shortage that we've always had, and this is pretty revolutionary. The 3,000 people that would usually die every year waiting for a kidney might now finally get a chance at a new kidney, even if it's not coming from a human. Now, I'll keep this part brief, but the science behind all of this is actually super cool. If we were to implant any pig kidney into a patient, it wouldn't work because our bodies would just immediately reject it and we would likely get many viruses. So that's where gene editing comes into play. 69 genes of this pig were edited. Some of them remove markers in the pig cell surfaces because our bodies can actually detect and reject foreign bodies because of different structures in the cell surfaces. Many of the other genes were to inactivate viruses that had become a part of pigs' genetic information. So by removing them, we ensured that viruses don't become active in our bodies. Going back to the big picture, if this works, we could get clinical trials for animal organ transfers, not just kidneys, but livers and hearts. And the success of that could be a massive milestone for the 100,000 people waiting for organ transplants in the US, and the 17 that die every day waiting for an organ. Now let's talk happiness. What's a good life if we're not happy? And that's the question that us in the young adult generation should really be asking ourselves, because we just ranked 62nd in the level of happiness by country. The 2024 World Happiness Report came out this month, and once again, Finland ranked number 1, followed pretty close by Denmark. Actually, all 5 Nordic countries ranked in the top 10, and a lot of Eastern European countries have been doing really well. But when you look at the US, there's a dark story to be told. For the first time, the US was not ranked among the top 20 happiest countries, and this was driven by Americans under 30. In 2017 and 2018, we had a descent in world happiness, and There was even an article in the Washington Post titled, quotes, "Perhaps tired of winning, the United States falls in the World Happiness Report." Well, aren't we tired of losing now? We ranked 23rd out of all 143 nations that were surveyed. Last year, we ranked 15th. We went down 8 places in just 1 year. But now, let's break things down by age, because it's pretty shocking. Young Americans under 30 ranked 62nd out of 143. When ranking their happiness out of 10, the old adults were almost a full point higher than those under 30. So what's making us more miserable than our parents and grandparents? Well, experts cite a bunch of different reasons, but there are 3 main ones. First, social media. Second, the pandemic and the isolation. And third, the state of the world right now. They say that the younger generation takes a bigger hit based on current news, such as climate change, the war in Gaza, and the war in Ukraine. And although this age trend is similar in a lot of countries, it's a lot more pronounced in the US. Some say that the expectation of happiness in the US can be at play here. The rhetoric around the US places it as the land of opportunity and happiness. So that's what we grow up learning. But when reality really hits and we realize that life isn't all butterflies and rainbows, we get sad and it's somewhat depressing. This realization usually comes in early adulthood. And because of what I just explained, it can be a lot more pronounced in the US. Now let's talk about an interesting study from this past month that made headlines everywhere. It said that intermittent fasting leads to a 91% increased likelihood of death from cardiovascular disease. Many articles said that this challenged the previous misconception that intermittent fasting was actually good for you. I don't want to get into the science behind intermittent fasting because there are a bunch of nuances and pros and cons that are hard to reconcile with. But I do want to talk about this study because it kind of demonized intermittent fasting with all these articles being published about it, when the study itself was not very sound at all, and the results were virtually meaningless. So let's break it down. The study had 20,000 participants, and each of them completed 2 24-hour dietary recalls, where they reported when they started and when they stopped eating the previous day. Then, with this amazing and definitely sufficient information, the researchers grouped the participants into groups based on the average eating duration. They basically made the assumption that this was their typical eating habit and that they would continue to have the same eating habit for the next 8 years, which the study followed the patients to see if they actually had any health events. So, did they really group the participants by intermittent fasting, or could they have just grouped them by people that had erratic eating habits? What if the group that reported an eating window of 8 hours and less was actually eating unhealthier food than the other group? There are many very, very weak assumptions in this study, and there's no adjustments for income, education, quality of food, or many other variables that can impact the results that they saw. And out of all 20,000 people in the study, only 414 of them were in the 8-hour eating group, giving it a relatively poor effect size, given all the other variables that could be at play here. And when we do look at these variables, the 8-hour group tended to be first, less educated, second, have a lower income, third, have less access to food, and fourth, they tended to smoke more. So in my opinion, the conclusions that were drawn from this study are not compelling at all, especially against all the research supporting intermittent fasting, even if those may have their own flaws. So I think this is a field that needs a lot more research, and I hope that this may serve as another lesson that we cannot take all research at face value. Now for the last detailed analysis of major healthcare news this month, let's talk about the abortion pill case, because it was making headlines everywhere this month. First, let's unpack the background a little bit. This case is about the drug called mifepristone, which is actually the most popular abortion pill in the US, being used for 2/3 of all abortions. The drug has been around since 2000, but In this case, after the overturn of Roe v. Wade, a bunch of anti-abortion doctors and organizations actually filed a lawsuit against the FDA. The plaintiffs want to invalidate the approval of the drug, saying that it's unsafe and that the FDA approval process was flawed. The FDA, of course, countered that and said that the drug is safe and effective, and they cited many studies that show how rare serious complications from the drug really are. By the time the case got to the Supreme Court, the main argument had changed a little bit. It was mostly around the changes that the FDA had made in 2016 and 2021 to increase access to the drug. These changes were pretty drastic, honestly. They allowed patients to get their pills from telemedicine and also allowed the pills to be shipped to your house. So this means that you can get them even in states where abortion is banned. In 2016, the time frame for mifepristone was also increased to 10 weeks from 7 weeks. So this case seeks to bring that back to 7 weeks, even though it might not really have much of a practical difference, because physicians can prescribe mifepristone 12 weeks into pregnancy using, quotes, medical discretion. So, to be honest, the story of how the case got to the Supreme Court is a little confusing, and I don't want to lose you guys, so let's just focus on what actually happened this month. When the case met the Supreme Court, which has a conservative majority, their response was generally pretty surprising. Pro-choice activists were pretty scared and tensed up, which makes sense, but the justices seemed very skeptical of the claims from the plaintiffs, since they have historically supported the FDA's scientific expertise. Even the 3 justices appointed by Trump seemed like they supported the FDA as long as any doctors with objections weren't forced to be involved with any abortions. It was rather weird to the justices that these doctors that opposed the use of abortion pills were complaining about how unsafe they were to patients, even though they don't prescribe the drugs and never saw patients that take the drugs. And the scientific evidence also says otherwise. So what happens now? Well, the justices don't make their decisions on the spot. They meet privately a few days after the hearing and talk about it. But the actual decision usually only comes out 3 months after the court hearing. So we can expect a decision sometime in late June if this case follows their usual practice. So with that, it's time to move on to the next section of this news episode, where I'm just going to fire at you all other news in healthcare from this month. This should give you a pretty good grasp at everything that happened related to healthcare. I encourage you to look up more about anything that you hear and find interesting. You should also send me a message or leave a comment, and I would love to talk about it further. And since we just talked about the abortion pill case, we might as well start with all the news in abortion, IVF, and maternal health. This month, Vice President Kamala Harris visited a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic in Minnesota, marking the first time ever that a vice president or president visits an abortion clinic. This goes to show how abortion has become a major political issue since the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and how it's going to be a major player in the upcoming elections. In IVF, clinics in Alabama reopened this month after a protection law was passed, shielding IVF clinics from any lawsuits against damaged embryos. This is not to say that patients aren't reluctant about their treatments, and many suffered psychological damage. An interesting piece on the New York Times also highlighted that some couples in other states are skipping sex and going straight to IVF, citing that many like being able to pick the gender of their kid. This month, a Democrat also won a state house seat in Alabama, running primarily on the issue of IVF, and this got a lot of support. In women's health, President Biden signed an executive order to boost women's health research to overcome the underrepresentation of women in research. A large study in Canada found that teen pregnancies make you twice as likely to die before the age of 31. Birth control is soon going to be available over the counter, mostly as the oral contraceptive O-pill. In New York, birth control pills, vaginal rings, and contraceptive patches are all soon going to be available over the counter. On the topic of flawed research, more research papers have been pulled away from Dr. Sam Yoon, the chief of cancer surgery at Columbia, who we talked about last month. So check out the February news episode if you want to hear more about the situation. In weight loss, these new GLP-1 drugs like Wegovy and Zepbound are defying a common trend with most prescription drugs: non-adherence. Doctors report all the time that their patients cannot stick to their medications consistently, but the story is different for weight loss drugs. Doctors have reported that their patients can stick to these drugs a lot better. Wegovy has been approved this month for more than just weight loss. The FDA approved its use for heart benefits, such as reducing the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and overall cardiovascular mortality in adults who have heart disease and are overweight or obese. This month, researchers from Yale estimated that Ozempic takes between 89 cents and $4.73 to make for a whole 1 month supply, while Novo Nordisk charges patients $1,000 for a 1 month supply of the drug. In other pharmaceutical news, Eli Lilly's Alzheimer's drug called donanemab had its approval delayed. We expected that the FDA was going to approve this drug that could slow the progression of Alzheimer's, but they will now convene to further assess the drug's safety and efficacy. As for CVS, Ohio fined the drugstore chain for $1.5 million due to 27 cases involving safety and staffing concerns. In mental health this month, California passed a law to establish their CARE Corps program, short for Community Assistance, Recovery, and Empowerment Court. This program allows anyone with untreated schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders to receive a personalized treatment plan and support from a care team. Proposition 1 also passed in California this month by a very slim majority. The proposition aims to expand treatment centers and supportive housing for individuals with mental illness and addiction. It seeks to authorize $6.38 billion in bonds for facilities and housing, amend the Mental Health Services Act to redirect about $140 million annually from cities to the states, and allocate approximately $1 billion for housing homelessness veterans, and allocate approximately $1 billion for housing of homeless veterans struggling with mental illness or addiction. In viruses and bacteria, meningitis is on the rise. Last year, there were 422 cases of invasive meningitis disease in the US, the highest number since 2014. This year, we already had 143 cases, which is 62 more than the number of cases at the same time last year. The measles outbreak also continues to worsen, and we've now reached more cases this year than in all of 2023. For COVID news, a man in Germany had 217 COVID shots, and doctors say that his immune system response remains remarkable, and he appears to fight off COVID better than most. The FDA also approved a new drug called Pemgarda to help protect very immunocompromised patients who don't get enough protection from the normal vaccine. In Medicare Medicaid news, Medicaid has been coming after the family home. The Medicaid Estates Recovery Program allows Medicaid to ask for reimbursement after a person that had some sort of long-term care is deceased. They can go after a person's assets to repay all of the long-term Medicaid costs. This could be from cash that they left behind or any stocks or bonds, but many times their last asset comes down to being their property, which is the only thing of value that many people leave behind. Aside from a few exceptions, Medicaid usually takes the home away even if other family members are still living in the house, creating a ton of distress. In general well-being news from this month, there were a couple of interesting headlines. First up is an article in colon cancer, which I wish had some more research put into it. The incidence of colon cancer among young adults in the US is increasing. That's an undeniable truth. This article in the New York Times by Knavu Sheikh tries to make sense of all of this. She mentions genetic mutations, lifestyle and dietary changes such as increased consumption of red meat, ultra-processed foods, sugary beverages, and decreased physical activity, and also the rise of obesity rates. She also mentions changes in the gut microbiome, exposure to toxic chemicals in the environment, and geographic disparities, which all may play a role. And she's right, they all may play a role in colon cancer. But I really think that she missed a really big factor here, which is the decreased fiber consumption. Only 4% of men and 12% of women meet their recommended fiber intakes. And fiber plays a crucial role in increased bowel movements. It also binds to bile acids, and it even has some evidence of lowering cholesterol. It just keeps your gut clean, so you're less likely to get colon cancer. So make sure you are eating your fiber. But on a positive note, we may soon see a blood test for colon cancer. Now, this next article, I don't even know why I'm putting it here, but it's titled, quotes, "Toddlers smell like flowers. Teens smell goat-like. Study finds." Yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. Well, there was this new study, and that's what the article's titled. Let's talk about the climate and our health. A new study found that only 10 out of 134 countries achieved the World Health Organization standards for particulate matter in their air. That's a major no-no for air quality and health. The government now finally banned the last form of asbestos that was still in use in the US, putting us among the 50-plus nations that have totally banned the carcinogen. Now let's talk hangnails. You know those freaking pieces of skin that hang right next to your nail and you pull them off and it just hurts a ton and then they come back? Well, I finally found an article on how to get rid of those. Well, I haven't tried it yet, but it's supposed to work, and I hope it does. What the article says is that you have to put your finger in warm water and then clip off the skin with something sterile. And then you put Aquaphor or Vaseline on it. And to prevent any hangnails, you just have to keep your hands moisturized. You can thank me later. If it works, of course. I'm not sure if it does yet. In San Francisco, officials reported that taking an antibiotic after sex reduces cases of chlamydia and syphilis. Or at least it did in San Francisco. It literally cut the number of cases by half. In health insurance this month, Mount Sinai signed a deal with United Healthcare to keep the major hospital system in the United Healthcare's network. If this deal wasn't reached, thousands of United Healthcare patients that go to Mount Sinai would have needed to find new doctors. There was also significant news on the Cyberattacks that we also talked about last month. And United Healthcare is in the picture once again. Change Healthcare, a big unit of United Healthcare, had to shut down parts of its operations late last month because of the cyber attack. Now a bunch of hospitals, clinics, and doctors are frustrated because they are having to wait for their reimbursements. In global healthcare news, let's start with some updates on the South Korea doctor strike. The government suspended licenses of thousands of doctors who were protesting, and many senior doctors even submitted for their resignation. Some doctors were also arrested. This is significantly weighing on President Yoon's party as they near re-election. In Gaza, children and pregnant women suffer the most from hunger and malnutrition. In Haiti, hospitals have become either looted by gangs or abandoned by the employees. Those that still remain open are too dangerous for those who need care to get to. As for female genital cutting, even though campaigns seem to become more popular against it, the number of cases continues to rise. In Gambia, a 2015 bill banning genital cutting was overturned this month. Now, for medical devices, biotech, and AI, there's a new way to do CPR. It's a lot more complicated, but it's showing promising results. eCPR, or extracorporeal cardiopulmonary resuscitation, is a medical procedure that involves using a machine to provide heart and lung support to patients in cardiac arrest when traditional CPR is ineffective. The way this works is pretty cool. The machine pumps and oxygenates the blood outside of the body, allowing the heart and lungs to rest and recover, while the underlying cause of the cardiac arrest is treated. This is really hard to implement because of the challenges in implementation, coordination, and training, and also the need for collaboration between a bunch of different groups of people, which is hard to get in an emergency situation. Next, the Impella heart pump, used to support the heart in patients undergoing complex procedures or with life-threatening conditions, has been linked to 49 deaths and dozens of injuries worldwide due to the risk of puncturing the heart wall. The FDA issued an alert but allowed the device to remain in use, criticizing the manufacturer, Biomed, for not notifying the agency sooner about the perforation risk. This alert follows recent concerns about the deadly side effects of cardiac devices and is the third major FDA action for an Impella device in a year. Biomed, now owned by Johnson & Johnson MedTech, claims there are no reported instances of heart wall perforations related to product design or manufacturing. Despite the risks, some cardiologists believe that Impella devices are valuable and necessary in certain situations. Now let's talk all drugs and alcohol. What's new this month? Starting off with alcohol, alcohol-related liver disease deaths have jumped 39% in recent years. This condition usually arises when men have more than 14 drinks a week and women have more than 7 drinks a week for an extended period of time. The trick here is that you don't notice anything until it's too late and you cannot reverse it. Still on alcohol, we're seeing a change in old adults' drinking patterns. They seem to be drinking more and more after the pandemic. Many cite that it's a way to combat loneliness, and it's the only time that they feel good and happy. Now let's talk about weed. Biden even mentioned it during the State of the Union address, signaling that he's moving to embrace the issue. In New York, illegal weed shops have far outnumbered those with legal licenses, with over 2,000 illegal shops in New York and only 85 legal dispensaries. The state government has called to speed up the licensing process. Many Americans are now using weed to help with their workout, saying that it helps with focus as well as with chronic pain. There's also an increased use of cannabis for anxiety, but people should be careful with how they're using it, and more research is warranted in these areas. Now for psychedelics, which seem to be the new hot topic on social media. An ethics complaint was filed against one of the first and most prominent psychedelic researchers and believers from Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffiths. In the complaint, Matthew Johnson, one of Griffiths' longtime collaborator, said that Griffiths was infusing his research with religious symbolism and that he also allowed donors with interests in drug legalization to assist in the studies. Ibogaine, a powerful psychedelic, remains illegal in the US, but there are optics that it could be soon used to treat PTSD, addiction, and brain injury. New research is being done on its potential in medicine as we speak. In archaeology, an almost 2,000-year-old bone stash filled with black henbane seeds was discovered in the Netherlands. This could be some of the earliest evidence of psychedelics during the Roman era. In more drug news, the term overdose has been under fire, with some critics saying that it blames the victim for their death. They are suggesting that the word poisoned should be used instead. Oregon is recriminalizing the possession of street drugs to try to combat the rising overdose deaths. Or should they say, poisoning deaths. Now let's end with some remarks from our president and former president on a few healthcare issues. Let's start with one of Trump's tweets from his social media company account, Truth Social. He says that he's not running to terminate the ACA, but to strengthen and change and make it less expensive. He says he's going to make the ACA a lot better. Biden, on the other hand, finalized a rule to curb one of the former president's policy, which expanded access to health plans that were cheaper but had fewer benefits than those sold under ACA marketplaces. At the center of his re-election campaign, Biden appeared with Pelosi and Obama to celebrate the 14th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. Biden's budget proposal seeks to lower healthcare costs. In New Hampshire this month, he emphasized how he's going to cap insulin prices, make permanent tax credits under the ACA, and limit out-of-pocket expenses for prescription drugs. But we all know how many of these promises go. And this brings us to the end of March 2024 healthcare news. I hope you enjoyed everything. And once again, I changed things up a little bit from last month's episode. So let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, and what I should change for next month's episode. And again, if any news that I mentioned here particularly interests you, feel free to shoot me a message on one of our social media platforms, and I would love to chat with you there. I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you learned a lot from healthcare news. I'll see you guys again for another healthcare news episode next month. And for now, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay healthy. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Gustavo Franco podcast. We hope our exploration of the world of healthcare has been insightful and thought-provoking for you. The opinions expressed here are ours and of our guests, and should not be considered professional advice. This podcast is a collaborative learning experience for both the producers and listeners. While we strive to convey accurate and up-to-date information, we acknowledge that our research may have limitations. We encourage all of our listeners to supplement their knowledge by conducting their own research. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date on our future releases, make sure to subscribe or follow us on your preferred podcast platform and social media. We highly value your feedback, so please don't hesitate to reach out with your thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future topics. Together, we can foster a more educated America and contribute to a more effective healthcare future. Thank you for joining us on this healthcare exploration.